It's an honor to welcome to the House today members of the Team Canada from at the 50-year anniversary of their victory at over the Soviet national team in the '72 Summit Series. 1972 was the year that the Cold War spilled into the world of sports. In July, American and world chess champion Bobby Fischer had defeated the Soviet champion and #2 world competitor Boris Spassky. And in the Munich Olympics, the American basketball team had lost a bitter and still contested gold medal game against the Soviet Union. But neither of these events produced such drama or lasting glory as the Summit Series. The series pitted, for the first time, the best Canadian professionals, although some of them look too young to have been there, against the Soviet players who were at the time underestimated, but preparing quietly for a surprise. It was to be the true test of hockey supremacy, played under the shadow of a much deadlier contest for global supremacy. The Canadian Ministry of External Affairs suggested that the encounter could be called a friendship series. Thank goodness the players ignored that and had the good sense to compete fiercely. Although most commentators and most Canadians expected the series to be an easy one, after a shocking 7-3 loss in Game 1 in Montreal, it became clear that the series would not be a friendly exhibition of Canada's superiority. As the losses mounted, the pressure on our players grew, the low point being the series' Game 4 in Vancouver, when some of the crowd rained boos down on their defeated heroes. Canadians simply couldn't understand how these NHL All-Stars, these legendary names that they knew so well, could be outscored by a team of Russian amateurs. The Canadian fans had not yet realized what had become clear to the Canadian players. These Russians were actually really good. They were playing a different game than the NHLers were used to. A game of speed and finesse, long lead breakout passes, and pinpoint cross-ice accuracy. By the end of the series, the names of those faceless Russians would be household names in Canada. We know them now, we knew them then, and now many of them play in the leagues on this side of the ocean, or at least their children and grandchildren now do. Names and faces that Canadians would come to know and respect in international tournaments and in exhibitions pitting Soviets against NHL competitors. By the time the Canadian team left to train in Europe ahead of the 4 games in Moscow, the idea of a friendship series was long dead. From this side of the Cold War, knowing how it ends, we can afford to look back objectively. But in the moment and at the time, the series had become, to borrow the name of the 40th anniversary documentary, The Cold War on Ice. The '72 series was the first time the term Team Canada was applied to a Canadian hockey team. In the minds of Canadians and fans following the series around the world, and on both sides of the Iron Curtain, Team Canada versus Team Russia had become us versus them. 2 styles, 2 different ways of life, 2 fundamentally incompatible ideologies and system of government. Democracy versus totalitarianism, communism versus free enterprise, freedom versus repression. Cliches never tell the whole story, but they often tell the most important part. This is true of the stories we are told today of the '72 series. Before the series, we told ourselves that we were the best hockey country in the world, and that our way of playing was the only way to play properly. During the series, we realized that this wasn't quite true. For having lost those 4 games, and having seen the competitive grit and the finesse of a team of a different style, we learned that we needed to up our game. In the last game on home ice, the frustration of Canadian fans in Vancouver's Pacific Coliseum erupted as boos rained down from the bleachers. Team Canada lost, falling 4-2. In a now iconic post-game interview, the legendary Phil Esposito pleaded with Canadians. To quote the elder Esposito brother, he said, I am completely disappointed. I can't believe it. Some of our guys are really, really down in the dumps. We know. We're trying. They got a good team. Let's face the facts. But it doesn't mean we're not giving 150%, because we are. Every one of us, every one of the guys, 35 guys that came out and played for Team Canada, we did it because we love our country. But on foreign ice, in front of hostile fans, with their backs against the wall, down 2 games, Team Canada rallied to win the last 3 games, each by a single goal. Each of those winning goals was scored by the great Paul Henderson. His name is immortalized in Frank Hewitt's frantic play-by-play call that erupted through thousands, actually hundreds of thousands and probably millions of televisions and radios in classrooms and workplaces across the country. Henderson has scored, and the crowd goes wild, of course. Ladies and gentlemen in the audience would not have been so pleased, of course, but those here on the other side of the world would have applauded and cheered with such a vibrating and powerful force that it would have been heard all around the globe. It's a call that still thrills us all half a century later, even those of us who were born after 1972, who have only heard the echo of those cheers, still revel in the legacy that they represent. When we hear those calls and we see those names, the names that are here today, Yvon Cournoyer after the winning goal, for example, it takes us back to a different time and a different world. It was 17 years before the fall of the Berlin Wall. Just a few months before the wall fell in May of 1989, a 20-year-old Alexander Mogilny would become the first Soviet star to defect to the West to play in the NHL. He was charged with deserting the Soviet Red Army, in which he was nominally an officer. Shortly after that, a crumbling and cash-strapped Soviet hockey system and Soviet Union would come crashing down as well. 2 years after that, in 1991, the Soviet Union, which in 1972 had appeared almost invincible, officially came to an end. I say almost invincible because this Team Canada showed that they were anything but. That is something that the Canadian spirit brings alive in hockey, but also in all aspects of our lives. I think what is so special about the gentlemen gathered here today is that every single Canadian can see their own triumph in this legendary win. You've made us all proud. You've given us one of the defining moments of Canadian history. In fact, I think if any Canadian were asked to close their eyes and dream up the most Canadian moment, it would be hard to think of anything more Canadian than the 72 Summit Series victory. And so on behalf of all Canadians, I wish you a great congratulations, and I thank you for your contribution to our national story, and may we all live up to your incredible example of grit and determination and victory. Thank you.